Welcome to part one of our presentation on the United States Federal Census Records, presented by the Alabama Department of Archives and History. I'm Erica Eves, and I'm a reference archivist in the EBSCO Research Room. I'm presenting the Getting to Know the Census portion of this presentation that focuses on the population schedules, the most commonly used census records. The U.S. federal census of the population was enacted by Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution in order to collect the proper taxes and apportion them among the states starting in 1790. This act made the United States the first country in the world to require the regular taking of a census. Every 10 years, Congress passes a law to authorize the taking of the census. Each census is a federal responsibility. Although states usually encourage their population to participate, they are not involved in the actual census taking process or its maintenance. If doing census research for someone living in Alabama, 1820 is the first for the state. However, only 9 of the counties are accounted for. The other counties on record are believed to be lost. Due to the 72-year rule, the most recent census records we have access to is the 1940 census. The 1950 census will be released in April 2022, 72 years after it was taken. Any more recent information can only be retrieved from the Census Bureau by the individual whom it is about or their immediate heirs. Unfortunately, some of these historical documents have been lost over the years. The first census records were required to be stored in their respective federal district clerk's offices, while summaries were sent to the president. When Congress passed a law in 1830 calling for all census records to be sent to Washington, D.C., many of the records never came. They either could not be found or were just never sent by the clerks. Many decades later, some records are unexpectedly discovered still in federal district court offices. The table on the left shows what records are in existence for the states and territories between 1790 and 1820. Unlike some of the early records that are only partial losses, the 1890 census is a near total loss, with only fragments surviving. There was a budget for only one copy of the census in 1890, due to the financial crisis. This copy was stored at the Commercial Building, where in 1921 a fire broke out, destroying 25% of the census records. Water from the efforts to put out the fire soaked another 50% of the records. Some of this may have been salvageable. However, in accordance with the federal retention policy in place in 1932, the chief clerk of the census included the 1890 census records on a list of materials to be disposed of. After authorization from the Librarian of Congress, the entire 1890 census was gone by 1934. In the beginning, it was the responsibility of the U.S. Marshals of the Federal District Court System and the clerks to make copies, maintain the census records, and hire enumerators to take the census. The census office began operating in 1850. By 1880, they were allowed to hire their own census takers, leaving the federal court system out of the process. The census office would not become a permanent federal agency known as the Census Bureau until 1902. One important factor to remember about the taking of the census is the difference between the census day and the enumeration day. The census day is the day set aside every 10 years that is used for the collection of statistics. Each person is expected to answer census questions according to the status of their household on that day. For example, in 2020, that day is April 1st. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a list for each census day from 1790 to 1950. The enumeration day is the day in which the census taker was present at the household asking the questions pertaining to that year's census day. On the next several slides, we will discuss what kinds of things can be found on the census. Age information is a common question when searching through the census. The 1900 census is the only one that asks for specific birth information, giving the year and month of birth. The rest of the records, 1850 to 1880 and 1910 to 1940, only ask for the age at last birthday. Having the age can at least give a ballpark range for birth year. Just subtract the age from the census year and then use a range of plus or minus 1 year. One rule of thumb, the closer the person's birth year to the year the census was taken, the more accurate age tends to be given. Another helpful indicator on the census is the relationship to the head of the household. The 1880 census is the first one in which the individual relationship of the head of the household is indicated. According to instructions, members of the household are meant to be listed head of household first, followed by their spouse and their children, and then the rest of those living in the home. Those could be in-laws, siblings, other family members, lodgers and boarders, or servants. Birthplace is another helpful indicator found on some census records. 1850 to 1870 and 1940 records include the location of birth for each individual indicated as a U.S. state or a country. The 1880 to 1930 census records indicate the individual's birth location and that of each of their parents. In some cases, as you can see on the 1940 record on the right-hand side of the screen, the census takers were more detailed and provided the city and state the birth location. In the first column, you can see the first person's birth location is listed as Birmingham, and the one below is listed as Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The 1940 census also indicates a person's location on April 1, 1935. This is a helpful indicator for tracking an ancestor's movements. Speaking of tracking movements, some census records also provide immigration and citizenship information. The most detailed immigration information can be found on the 1900 to 1930 census records, each of which include the year the person immigrated and the status of the time the census was taken. Status is indicated as either AL for alien, NA for naturalized citizen, or a third option, PA for papers, to indicate the person has started the process of becoming a naturalized citizen. The 1920 census also gives the year a person became naturalized. 1910 through 1930 indicates if the person could speak English or not and what language is spoken otherwise. Each of these things is great indicators for getting to know one's family. Census records are also a good place to find out if a person served during wartime. On the 1840 census, there is a column to indicate the name and age of a person in the household who was receiving a Revolutionary War pension. This, of course, leads a researcher to look through U.S. military records for more information. The 1910 census offers information on surviving Union and Confederate veterans using certain abbreviations. CA for serving in Confederate Army, CN for Confederate Navy, UA for serving in Union Army, and UN for Union Navy. The 1930 census has indications for veterans of any U.S. military action, including the Civil War, the World War or World War I, the Spanish War, the Philippine Insurrection, the Boxer Rebellion, and the Mexican Expedition. One final note about things you can find on the census. The further back in the census records you go, the less information you'll be able to find. 1830 and 1840 are the earliest complete census records available for Alabama. Those, as well as the 1790 to 1820 records, only provide the names of the head of the household. All other members of the household, including slaves and free people of color, or only tick marks, are numbers in the age range categories. The records require more extensive detective work and comparison in identifying your ancestors. Birth information on these can only be broadly estimated. Using the census day for that year, for example, a tick mark in the under 5 years of age column on the 1830 census would indicate a child born between June 2, 1825 and May 31, 1830, if they stuck strictly to the instructions. Remember, census records are historical documents with inherent flaws. Speaking of flaws, what happens if you find a mistake on the census record? The Census Bureau answers this on their website. Inaccuracies are common, but because they are historical documents, they cannot change the records. Follow their advice and make a note of the possible inaccuracy with the record in your genealogy research. Future generations may benefit from this note. You may also find an interesting story for why the census record is wrong. Sometimes families deliberately provided inaccurate information to Americanize their names, deny the existence of a child born out of wedlock, or not identify their true racial background. These inaccurate responses reflect the era's feelings about race, ethnicity, and a host of other social conditions that can enlighten future generations. Now, if you're using a personal Ancestry.com account, you can submit alternative information. In these two examples here, multiple alternatives are shown by the information given in brackets. For Grover Cleveland King, to note his full middle name and an alternative birth year, other than the one that was calculated using the age given on the census record. The other example, for Pocahontas Graves, accounts for multiple spellings and one to account for her maiden name King. She also has an alternative birth year. To submit alternative information, you must click on the View Add Alternative Information link on the left-hand side of the screen. In the pop-up window, choose which information you want to supply and then follow the instructions to enter your information. Be cautious with this, however, because this information is not verified and it's only user submitted. So don't add alternative information unless you are absolutely certain, and check for other clues to verify if the information is correct before you believe what someone else has submitted. We're now going to switch gears and focus on how to search the census records, particularly while using Ancestry, which is, if you do not have your own account, you can access for free in the EBSCO research room with our institutional account once we reopen. Since we always suggest starting with the 1940 census and moving backwards from there in your family tree, I will use that as a starting point and example. When specifically searching the 1940 U.S. Census records on Ancestry, there are 31 different data points for which you can choose to search. It is not necessary to know or even fill something in for each of these points. In fact, I suggest you start with just the name, approximate birth year, and maybe a broad location. This will help you control your results and avoid eliminating possible matches by entering too much information. I find it best to start broad and then narrow down from there. I do not suggest using the exact searching option in most situations because it does not account for misspellings, misinformation, and other known factors. However, using exact or the ranges it offers can help narrow things down when searching for common names or specific areas. For instance, if you know for absolute certain that the person is supposed to be in Alabama, you can limit the search for just the state and surrounding states, or even specific counties and surrounding counties. Speaking of locations and counties, you also need to be aware of the state and county boundaries associated with the time period you're searching. Counties were created over time and boundaries have changed. See the changes in the counties for Alabama from 1820 to 1980 below, which is only a small portion of the changes. Your ancestor may have lived in the same house or town, but was it always in that county? This is a more common conundrum during the 19th century. Another option when searching for your ancestors is to use a person's race or nationality to limit the search results. You need to be careful when using this option too, because it doesn't always account for different terms used in the past. However, over the years, Ancestry has developed codes to help overcome the differences in the terminology. For instance, if you put Black in the race nationality search box, it should bring up anyone listed as colored, Black, or Negro. The census takers did not always follow the prescribed rules they were given on the terms to use and used the ones that were usually common to their region. The people sometimes also chose to identify themselves as something different for social or political reasons. If unsure, you can also use the keyword search box to search nationality terms, such as Greek, Russian, German, or whichever. Another thing to keep in mind when searching your ancestry is various spellings of names. Misspellings can occur for various reasons. Your ancestors may not have known how to spell their own name. The census taker may not have known how to spell the name. Also, your ancestors may have given the census taker their nickname instead of their full legal name, despite what the instructions intended. Mistakes or purposeful misinformation is not uncommon. Let's look back at Pocahontas King Graves. She first appears on the 1900 census as an infant under the nickname Polky with H as a middle initial. On the 1920 census, she is again listed under a nickname, this time Polka, initially mistranscribed as Rosa Graves on the ancestry transcriptions. I knew this was the right person, though, because I had her marriage record to General J. Graves, who is listed here in the census with her. She frequently appears under nicknames in her legal records. Another reason Ancestry's alternative information option can be helpful, but again, always verify your information. Another tip when using Ancestry or any other site for searching the census records, always look at the image provided in the actual census page. Transcription errors are common and can cause issues when searching. I have two examples here. First, we have Verge Phillips. Now, I don't blame the original transcriber for having issues deciphering the first name because there is information written over it. However, if you enlarge the area and look a little closer, you can somewhat make out the correct name. Of course, we also have the context of knowing that the name is supposed to be Verge. Second, we look at another member of the King family, Matilda, who married David Faust. It took a long time and some time-consuming techniques for me to locate Matilda. Once I did find her, it became clear why. Even though I was doing a broad search with the last name Faust, it did not find her because she was listed as Matilda Forrest in the Ancestry transcription. Once I saw the original record, to me it clearly says Faust. Transcribers of the census records don't always have the context that a genealogical researcher does when searching for their family. Also, census takers' handwritings aren't always very clear or neat. I was also given the bonus once I found Matilda that her younger maiden sister Melissa, identified here as Melissy King, is living in the household. I originally thought she had passed away due to the lack of records. While I still don't know when she died, I at least know that Melissa is still around and living in her sister's household in 1880. A few more tips for searching your ancestors on the census. If you have a family member that has seemingly disappeared, you should try using the fan club approach. Family, associates, and neighbors. Like with Melissa King, who I later finally found living in her sister's house. Search for a person's family members and associates, siblings, parents, in-laws, aunts, uncles, even employers if you know them. If you are sure they should be in the same location, look for a known neighbor on the census and check to see if they're listed nearby. However, when searching for neighbors, it's best to look for those who are indicated as owning their property, as they are more likely to be there on the following or previous census records. The 1900 to 1930 census records have a column to indicate if the home is owned or rented by the head of household. Earlier census records have columns that indicate the value of the real estate and the value of personal property. This can be particularly helpful in the 1860 census if it could indicate that someone was a slave owner, because slaves were identified as valuable personal property. You would then need to locate that individual on the slave schedule to confirm that they were indeed a slave owner. Other helpful information that can be used when searching for or learning more about your ancestors, their occupation. If their occupation is unique, you may be able to use it to search for them on the census. Or if they can't be found on the census, you can check for them under their known occupation in a city directory. Occupations in a city directories can also help track an individual's location in between census records. One of the most important things you need to do is document and organize your research. Always note where you found your information and search tactics you use. Keep things for each individual separate and organized. Print the individual, original, and transcribed pages from Ancestry, and take notes on separate pages if you're searching multiple individuals and families at one time, although I do suggest you try to search for only one person at a time. Organization and documentation helps to keep an already inherently confusing and difficult task a little more coherent. One last tip. If you have tried everything to find an individual and you are certain that they should be in a certain general location, you may need to resort to searching the census page by page for that county or that general area. This is how I was finally able to find Matilda King Faust, when she was originally mistranscribed as Forrest. When doing this, you want to search that particular census using just the location you're looking for. Then choose the first result that comes up with the right location, and then check the original census page. At the bottom of the screen, once the original census page is up, you should click on the green film strip button and choose the first image that is for the section you want to check. Then, using the arrows on either side of the screen, you can move back and forth between the pages looking for your family members. This is a time-consuming process, but it can sometimes provide positive results. This concludes the Getting to Know the Census presentation. Stay tuned to learn more about other federal census documents in Part 2. Thank you.